A World of New Light. Written by Maggie Finally Writes. Read by Arashi. Sylvain would never forget the day Ingrid and Gled had met, the dazzle in their eyes as Glen had taken her hand in greeting. It was rare for two so young to find their fated matches, but they had been one of the lucky few, living an entire life seeing color as the rest of their little friend group was stuck in a world of drab grayscale. Okay, blacks, whites, and grays. It wasn't uncommon for Sylvain to bother his dear friend Ingrid about what she just saw. "Ingrid, what's it like to be able to see in color?" "Sylvain, you ask me this all the time." "Yeah, but it's not my fault you were the first one of us to do so." "Why don't you ask Glen then?" He'd always shrug, Ingrid rolling her eyes as she pointed ahead to an apple tree. "It's like everything over there just looks prettier than before. The apples don't fade into the tree, like before. They're vivid and red. Look, it's hard to explain, okay? Just find your soulmate and you'll see." Now it was Sylvain's turn to roll his eyes. "You make it sound so easy, Ingrid." "Well, have you been meeting other ladies? Or maybe gentlemen, too?" "Oh, trust me, Ingrid, I have." As a child, Sylvain would run amok, touching everyone. Just simple little pokes, of course, but still, anyone who visited the Gautier home. The servants, they were visiting another home, their servants, and yet still the world stayed a dreary splash of black, white, and gray. As he grew older, it was no longer acceptable for him to just poke and prod random strangers. Thus, he became someone who flirted just for a single touch of anyone's hand, though usually a lady's, and once he had the grasp, he'd hope finally the world around them would light up. But alas, the world stayed in all grays, and he'd let go of their hand. And perhaps because he was Sylvain, he'd take them on a date or two, but never more, for they weren't his soulmate, weren't his fated match. It was cruel, especially considering Ingrid had always been fated to Glen. She was the first of their friend group to match, and then, shortly behind, Dimitri had as well, with a man from Dusker no less. The nobles surrounding Dimitri disproved the to-do's appearance, and the court, a stalwart wall there to protect both his love and lord, and it was that bond that gave Dimitri the strength to ensure no one harm to do, both in their own way having each other's backs at all times. Even Ingrid had to admit it was romantic in a way, and Sylvain had to agree too, though a bitterness soon began to grow in him as more of his friends found their fated partners, and he was growing to be left alone in that colorless world. He almost ended up similar to Felix, calling off this idea of soulmates after Ingrid lost Glen. Why should he have to spend the rest of his life with someone he barely knew just because the goddess made it so? He almost went down that path. Almost. But he still so desperately wanted to see the world as those who did find their soulmates did. Even if they simply touched and went on their way, nobility didn't always marry their fate match if they were crestless or a peasant. Sylvain just wanted to know the beautiful world he had been blinded from his entire life, his efforts becoming more and more desperate when Felix of all people matched with Annette. Felix had stayed Felix, but even Sylvain could never forget the look in his old friend's eyes as he brushed his hand against the sweet redhead, helping her up from where she had tripped. Never in his life did he think he'd see Felix of all people mesmerized, and the bitterness only began to grow more and more. If only Sylvain knew the person he was so desperately looking for had been right in front of him the entire time, spending months of the time going after almost every available woman, and the men at Garrigmock, even daring to flirt with Flame in his desperation. He just knew she had to be close. He could feel it in his heart and soul, and desire to join his friends in that dazzling world. It was an accident that triggered it that had been the most ironic part. They had been sparring, Sylvain with Felix and Mercedes with Annette, both being backed up into corners by their respective partners, when Sylvain's elbow accidentally scraped against her back, and the world went alive in color. Sylvain froze as Mercedes swiveled around to see just who, dazzled by how much more handsome Sylvain looked in this new light. It was an indescribable beauty, finally being able to see the colors Ingrid had once tried to describe to him when they were young. Sylvain looking quickly to see a tree, the brightness of the flowers contrasting with the leaves just as Ingrid had described all those years ago. "Sylvain?" Her soft voice brought him back, now Sylvain swiveling around to see Mercedes. And wow, her eyes were gorgeous, a deep something color. He'd have to have someone teach him the names of all the colors, but for now, his focus was on Mercedes. "This entire time, you've been right here," Sylvain said, shaking his head in almost disbelief. Had he really not ever touched Mercedes? He did recall one time he'd hurt himself during training, and she'd offered to patch him up, but instead Sylvain opted to go to the infirmary so Manuela would touch him, if only he knew. Well, it's funny how these things work, don't they? Was her laugh always that pretty? I don't want to rush anything between us, but I do hope perhaps we could have some tea sometime soon. I think that's supposed to be my line there, Sylvain said with a chuckle of his own. But yes, how about after we finish up here, we'll get some tea? Sounds like a plan. She turned away from him, walking back to Annette as Sylvain watched her, noticing how it wasn't just the world itself he was seeing in a new light.